All right, welcome everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, Public Speaking for Career Success. So my name is Christy Foster. I'm Head of Engagement here with Conservation Careers. And we're really excited for today's webinar and really excited to welcome our special guest, Matt Abrahams. So before we start, I'd love to just ask everyone to reflect for a second on what your biggest fears are. So don't overthink it, just go with what comes to mind first. And as you're thinking about that, I just want to mention that you might be surprised to know that the fear of public speaking ranks up there. I see Matt nodding. It ranks up there with things like fear of dying and above things like fear of spiders. So you're not alone in this fear. So we're here to learn basically some expert tips and techniques and advice from an expert on public speaking, Matt Abrahams. So Matt's, he's an educator and a coach with Stanford University's Graduate School of Business. And we're thrilled to have you today here, Matt. So a very warm welcome.
Thank you so much.
And we'll pass it to Matt to introduce himself in a bit more detail in just a minute here. But while everyone's joining the call, I can see we've got 83 people online so far, which is fantastic. We actually had about 400 people sign up for this webinar, so an overwhelming response, which is great. And I just wanted to start by asking everyone a question. So I'm going to share this question on your screen here. You're going to see in a second a list of people, a list of 10 people. And hopefully some names on that list that you recognize. And the question is basically, which of these people has had a fear of public speaking? That's been documented. So you can answer as many as you'd like, but go ahead and select which ones you think have had a fear of public speaking. And while you're doing that, I also just wanted to apologize if anyone received an extra email reminder about the event. And hopefully that meant that everyone was very well informed about the time, the time and date. Great. So I can see the answers coming in. So far, we've got Princess Diana in the lead, followed by Mr. Bean. Excellent. And just give you another couple seconds here to submit your answers. Princess Di is still in the lead, it looks like. Great. So I think we'll stop there and I'll just share the results with everyone. Okay, so most people voted for Princess Diana, followed by Mr. Bean, Winston Churchill, Samuel L. Jackson. Everyone else is kind of on par there. But basically, all of these people on this list have had a fear of public speaking. And it's been strong enough that they've either felt ill or been ill when going to public speak, or they faked illness in order to avoid public speaking. So again, the message is just, this is a really common fear. You're not alone in this fear. And unfortunately, most people, I think, don't seek any support to overcome the fear. So the fact that you're here today listening to this webinar is a great start. All right, so I'll just close that for us. So let's get started. Again, my name's Christy Foster. I'm Head of Engagement at Conservation Careers. And we help about 500,000, actually over 500,000 conservationists each year. And we know that for many of those people, for many of you, public speaking is something that can be a barrier to success in your career, whether you're going into your first interview or whether you're making a presentation to a donor, or perhaps you're just put on the spot in an important meeting. So we want to look at, how can we help you trying to do all this amazing work for the planet, take public speaking from being something that's a challenge and a barrier to a tool that you can use in your career for good and hopefully even enjoy it in the process. So on that note, I'm really thrilled to welcome Matt Abrahams today, our special guest. He's an educator and coach from Stanford University's Graduate School of Business. He's also co-founder and principal of a company called Bold Echo Communication Solutions. And so they help people with their presentation and communication skills based in the US. He's written a book called Speaking Up Without Freaking Out, which I believe is now in its 3rd edition. Excellent. And he hosts a podcast called Think Fast, Talk Smart. So Matt, I'd love it. We're thrilled to have you here. I'd love it if you could just say a few words and introduce yourself to everybody.
Well, you've done such a nice job already, and thank you for having me. I am very thrilled to be here. I am somebody who is very passionate about communication and feel that communication can really make a big difference, not just in getting jobs, but also being successful in jobs. All of us have a lot to contribute, and unfortunately, sometimes anxiety can get in the way. And there's some other things we can learn to do better as well, how to be more clear, concise, compelling, and happy to be here to chat about those with you.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Matt. So we're going to sort of touch on a few questions that you may have seen when we shared the information about this webinar. So we're going to look at questions like, how does anxiety around public speaking hold people back in their careers? How you can develop public speaking skills and any tips and techniques around that. How to manage emotions like anxiety, which we all have, especially when we're hosting people who are experts in public speaking. How you can appear and feel more confident. And then lastly, how to speak up so that people listen to you and you can have more impact. And then at the end, we'll leave about 15 or 20 minutes for a live Q&A. So if you've got questions for Matt, please hold them till the end. And then at the end, we'll add them into the Q&A box. So that's just so that people can upvote questions. All right, so let's dive in. So Matt, how might anxiety around public speaking hold people back in their careers? What does that look like?
Well, so many people, the anxiety people feel gets in the way of folks, one, contributing in situations where they have an opportunity to give their ideas, their opinions, etc. It also prohibits or can get in the way of them actually sharing information, insight that could help the business grow better. And often people who are anxious don't put themselves in situations where their voice could really help, or they could get opportunity and exposure that could lead to very interesting career next steps. And so anxiety not just precludes people from speaking in the moment, it also can preclude them from even being in the room or the virtual session where the conversations are happening. So it is a big concern.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, it's interesting because often we say, one of the key steps when you're getting started in your career in conservation is simply to show up, just to be there and participate. And
Yes.
if this is something that holds you back from participating, obviously that's going to hold you back in your career.
Absolutely.
So if you're recommending, ways for people to help overcome their anxiety, what would that look like? And I imagine there's many techniques, but maybe just a few to focus on.
So I could talk for hours about this. First, let me be very clear. I don't believe that we ever overcome our anxiety. I think our anxiety is something that's real, and it's something that exists. It depends on the situation. So I've been doing this work for many, many years, decades, and I still get nervous in certain situations. So it's not about overcoming the anxiety, it's about managing the anxiety, because anxiety actually around communication can be very helpful. It can give you energy, can help you focus. It tells you what you're doing is important, but you want to learn to manage it so it doesn't manage you. And when it comes to managing anxiety, there are really two major areas you have to focus on. You have to focus on symptoms and managing the symptoms that you have when you get nervous. And then you have to manage the sources. And those are the things that actually make you nervous. So, Christy, if it's okay, I'll give one example of each and then you can dig into any of them. So many of us, when we get nervous, we have lots of physiological and cognitive symptoms that happen to us. So, for example, you might get a little shaky, you might perspire, you might talk really fast. Those are all symptoms of your anxiety. And there are things you can do to reduce some of those symptoms. So for example, taking a deep breath, a deep belly breath, slows down your fast heart rate, slows down your speaking rate. If you get the shakes, that's adrenaline. Doing big, broad gestures when you start gives that adrenaline a place to go because you're activating big muscle groups. If you perspire, that's because your blood pressure is going up. You're actually getting hotter when you're nervous. So you need to cool yourself down. Holding something cold in the palm of your hand can actually reduce blushing and perspiration that comes from that increased body temperature. So there are some very specific things that you can do to manage the symptoms. But sources also get in the way, and sources are things that make your anxiety worse. So let me give you one example, and there's several other sources, but the first that I'd like to talk about, especially when it comes to interviewing, has to do with the fact that what we're trying to achieve makes us nervous. So many of us get nervous in our communication because we are afraid of a potential negative future outcome. In other words, we have a goal. We want to get hired, or if we're in a meeting, we want our point to be well received. And we get nervous because we're afraid we won't achieve that. We're afraid we won't get hired. Our ideas will not be well received. My students that I teach are afraid they're not going to get good grades. The entrepreneurs I coach are afraid they're not going to get funded. These are all worries about a potential negative future outcome. And the way to short circuit that, research tells us, is to become present oriented, be in the present moment. Because by definition, if I'm in the present moment, I'm not worried about the future. So how do you do that? Well, lots of things. You can do something physical. Doing something physical gets us out of our head. You can take a walk around the block. You can talk to somebody else before you go into the interview, talk to a friend, a family member. That can really make you connect. It's hard to be worried about the future when you're actually involved in an interaction. You can do what athletes do, listen to a song or a playlist that gets them in the moment. Or you can do something that's silly, but actually very present oriented, invoking, and that is to start at 100 and count backwards by some very challenging numbers. Like start at 100 and count backwards by 17s. Christy, you're probably better at doing that math than I am, but it definitely can help. So when it comes to managing anxiety, it's not about trying to overcome it. It's about finding tools that help you manage it. And you have to manage both symptoms as well
Yeah.
as sources. Sorry for the long-winded answer.
No, that was great. I think it was nice to touch on the different techniques because probably I imagine that different people find it easier to say count back from 100 than they find it to listen to music. I'm sure everyone has their preference.
Sure.
That's great. And I really like the point that it's not about overcoming anxiety. I guess really we're hardwired to react to situations that we perceive as threats. And this is one of those. So is that kind of anxiety, is that the same, the same set of techniques if you're going into an interview or if you're going into delivering a presentation or if you're in a difficult meeting? Are those same types of techniques applicable in all of those cases?
So yes, much of the research and many of the techniques apply across different situations. Now, you have to explore each situation and your reaction to it to come up with techniques that work. So for example, in interviews and in meetings, one of the things that people get very nervous about is being judged and evaluated. And you are in those situations by definition for an interview. And that can make people very nervous. So you have to invoke some other techniques that can help you with that of fear of being judged or evaluated. So it's less about the situation and it's more about what's causing the anxiety. And in an interview, if you're afraid of being judged, a few things you can do to help. One, practice and simulations work really well. In fact, you can have somebody interview you. You can just visualize yourself answering, speak out those answers. There are even virtual reality tools. You can get goggles and download a free app on your phone. It's called Virtual Speech. Put it on, and all of a sudden you can see a large audience or a conference room with people sitting around a table or just one person sitting in front of you. And you can simulate practicing saying your presentation, your meeting contribution, or your interview answer to desensitize yourself. So one way to manage fear that comes with being judged is to desensitize yourself. Another way to do it is to realize that you bring value to the situation. A lot of us say lots of negative things to ourselves. Is this worth it? Am I a worthy person? They're better people than me. And if you actually start by telling yourself, hey, I'm bringing value here. There's something that I can contribute. And it's exciting for me to share that value in the meeting or in the interview. That can change your disposition and make you much less nervous. So it's not about the situation. It's more about what's causing the anxiety and then finding techniques that help you reduce that.
That's really interesting. Yeah, so we spend some time sort of working with people at Conservation Careers to help them going into interviews, and that's linked to some of the things you said. Often we encourage people to focus on what they're bringing
Mm-hmm.
the role potentially, but also to see it as a two-way conversation where it's not just about them being judged by a
Right.
person or by a panel, but about them figuring out if it's a good fit, and having a conversation to do that. But I really like the point that it's identifying where that anxiety is coming from is kind of key.
Right.
Great. Okay. So I wonder if it's okay and if there's time, would it be possible just to walk through one of the techniques that you particularly like or that you recommend to people? And feel free to say no.
Well, I never turned down an opportunity. So rather than that, here's what I think would be useful is I am all about having people create what I call an anxiety management plan, an AMP, because anxiety can actually amp you up and help you rather than be detrimental. So when it comes to creating an anxiety management plan, it's really about finding 2 or 3 techniques that will work for you. So I'm going to share my anxiety management plan with you, and then I will encourage you to think of what can work for you. So one of the things that really helps me is to get into the present moment. And getting in the present moment for me, if I can't connect with people in advance. So Christy and I actually had a nice chat before we came in today. That was very helpful to me to help me manage my anxieties, because rather than being distracted and running around, I was having technology problems. There was a lot of stress going on my end, but having the conversation, focusing on it really helped bring in the present moment. Another thing I like to do is I actually like to walk around the space. So even if it's a virtual call, a virtual interview, before I start, I'll actually just walk around a little bit, doing something physical. So for me, the first part of my anxiety management plan is to get present oriented. And I do that by connecting with people if I can, by doing something physical. And this is going to sound really silly, but it works really well. I say tongue twisters before I present or do an interview. You can't say a tongue twister right and not be in the present moment. So I have a very short tongue twister I say, gets me in the present moment. It also warms up my voice. Nobody ever hears me do this. In fact, if I weren't telling you, nobody would ever know. But those are ways I get present oriented. The next thing I do, the second part is I think to myself about what my goal is in the communication. What am I trying to achieve? And then once I figure that out or state that, I then say, here is how I'm bringing value or supporting that goal. So for this event I'm doing right now, my goal is to help share with you techniques you can learn that you can put into practice to help you feel more confident. And before I started speaking, I said to myself, you have several techniques, Matt, that you can share. So that's my anxiety management plan. And it helps me get present oriented and be passionate and share these ideas with you in a way that I'm not so nervous doing it. So I hope that helps, Christy. I hope that gives you some insight into what these techniques can look like and what they look like for me.
Absolutely. I think having that sort of personal example is ideal. And obviously it's going to be different for everyone.
Absolutely.
For me and for every single viewer who's watching. But I think that really helps to visualize what that plan might look like for people.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So apart from the managing anxiety component, what just general tips or techniques do you have for people to improve how they speak in public? Say that anxiety is already under control, more or less. Do you have any tips you offer just in general for public speaking?
Sure thing.
So
I'm going to divide these into 2 parts. I'm going to divide these into what you say and then how you say it. And I'll give you 2 examples for each. So when it comes to what you say, first and foremost, it is critical to have a goal. What are you trying to achieve? And I mentioned that as part of my anxiety management plan, but I'll give you more detail. To me, a goal has 3 parts: information, emotion, and action. What do I want people to know? How do I want them to feel? And what do I want them to do as a result of my communication? In an interview, it's usually pretty simple. I want them to know about me and how I'm qualified. I want them to feel curious and excited and confident that I am the right person. And ultimately, I want them to either hire me or bring me back for another interview. So the goal in an interview is pretty clear. But for a presentation or meeting contribution, the goal can be much more varied. What is it you want them to know? How do you want them to feel? Excited, concerned, inspired, listened to, motivated. I mean, there are lots of emotions. And then finally, what do you want them to do? In each of these aspects, know, feel, do, help you craft your message. If you want people to feel inspired, what are you saying and doing that will inspire them? If you want them concerned that if they don't act, bad things can happen, what are you doing to establish the concern and then give them direct pathway to action? So goal is critical, and you always have to start with, what is my goal? Now that goal is predicated on who your audience is, so it's going to change. So if you do the same topic for a different audience, your goal might have to be different. So the first part of your content is what's the goal, and then you have to think about how to structure it. Structure is critical. You have all listened to somebody who rambles, but by setting people's expectations and setting structures, it helps. I don't know if you've noticed, but in all of my answers, or most of my answers to Christy's questions, before I start, I give you a preview of what I'm going to do. That sets structure. I don't just start answering. When you have a presentation or a contribution, set that structure so people understand. So you have to figure out what the structure is. Let me give you an example of a structure. A very simple one that many of us know is problem, solution, benefit. Here's the problem we're trying to solve. Here are the steps to solve it, and here are the benefits of doing so. So if I can package my information in service of my goal into that structure, it helps. So those are the content pieces. That's the what you say. How you say it's really important. You need to make sure that people see you as confident. So it's all about being big, balanced, and still. When I am positioning my body, I fill up the screen. If I'm in person, I take up space. Nervous people make themselves smaller. Virtually, I sit farther away so you can't see my facial expressions. So you want to have a presence. So you want to be big. You want to be balanced. We don't tilt our heads. We don't lean. And you want to be still, no swaying or rocking. And then virtually and in person, when you communicate, eye contact is critical. I don't know if you've noticed, but when I'm answering questions, I look directly at the camera. When Christy is asking me questions, I actually take notes to make sure that I hit the right points. That's what helps me set the structure. So I might look down when I'm being asked a question. So how you answer is important as well. Big, balanced, and still, look directly at the camera. If you're in person, obviously you would not look at the camera, you'd look at the person. So two ideas or two approaches to being more effective: what you say, how you say it, goals and structure, big, balanced, and still, directly look at the camera.
That's brilliant. I remember one of the presentations that one of the talks you gave that I watched.
Mm-hmm.
And by the way, I highly recommend to anyone who's watching to go and look up Matt Abrahams and look up some of the other talks he's given, because they're excellent.
Well, thank you. You're now part of my PR team. Before we're done, I'll point people to some resources, but thank you.
Yeah, we'll definitely do that at the end. But I remember in one of the talks that you gave, you sort of said, this is an example of someone who's nervous, saying, "Oh, I'm really excited to be here." Meanwhile, they're actively backing away in fear.
Right.
So
right. That's right.
sometimes I guess they're not aware.
We believe, a lot of us focus on what we say, and it's absolutely important, but it is absolute fact that we believe a lot in how people say something. So if you say, "I'm really excited to be here," people are going to be, not so sure. So how you say something is as important, and in some cases more important than what you say.
Excellent. Okay. Now, I think you've touched on this a little bit already, Matt, but when people are going into important meetings or interviews or any of those situations, how can they look more confident than they feel?
Yeah. So fake it till you make it, and it's all about it's all about. It's actually funny, but it's also very true. If I present myself as confident, even if I'm not, and people see me as confident, they will treat me as confident, and I will begin to feel confident. So it's actually a virtuous cycle that happens. So there are several things you can do. Preparation and practice are critical and will help you. But when you show up, when you take up space, when you speak more slowly, when you demonstrate good eye contact, these are the cues and clues that people use to determine if somebody is confident versus not. So sometimes it's putting that on, it's acting that way. In other ways, it's removing the things that get in the way of that. So For example, many of us, when I'll give you an example that we're not seeing as much today, but when many of us stand in front of a room, if we're presenting, we often sway side to side. And that swaying side to side makes us look uncomfortable, makes us look nervous, makes it look like we don't want to be there. That's problematic. So what you have to do is stand balanced. And what you do is you take your feet and put them parallel underneath your shoulders. Many of us, when we stand like a penguin or a duck, and it makes it really easy to sway. But if you put your feet parallel underneath your shoulder, it locks your hips and you can't sway. So that's just an example of removing some of the things we do that signal anxiety, therefore making ourselves more confident looking, or we can actually put on the behaviors of confident people. So you can come at it from both approaches. In either case, it's easy. It helps you look confident.
I'm standing right now and reevaluating where my foot position is.
Interestingly, I am standing too, and I highly recommend in a virtual environment that people stand. It helps you focus, it gives you more attention, and it also, because you're standing upright, you can breathe more deeply and really support your voice.
Yeah. I really like what you've said about confidence in general, and I think that in the conservation sector, perhaps more so than many other sectors, a lot of people do struggle with things like imposter syndrome and just feeling like they have the value to deliver. So the fact that you can kind of reverse engineer it and start by acting confidently, seeing that people recognize your confidence and treat you as confident, and then boost your own confidence. I think that's brilliant.
It really helps, and I encourage everybody to really try it on, and they'll see how it can help them.
Okay. Just, this is a bit of an aside from our planned questions, but obviously you're coming from the business sector much more so. Do you find that people in the business sector share these same anxieties and fears around public speaking as any sector, really?
Absolutely. Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, it is, I believe this applies in all sectors, all walks of life and parts of life. Anxiety around communication holds true. Now, there are some sectors, some situations where you put yourself at risk more, and that can invoke more anxiety. So in the business world, many people are proposing ideas, they are asserting positions, and that can invite anxiety along with it. But people work in the business world in ways, they found ways to accommodate their level of comfort in these situations. So I wouldn't say one sector is more prone to anxiety than others. There are certain opportunities and roles in those different sectors that I think can be more or less anxiety provoking.
Just a curiosity question. That's great.
Sure.
So how can people then have a bit more influence and impact when they're speaking? Because we're in the conservation sector, obviously we're talking about people who largely want to do very good things for the planet and for others. And I'd love to hear more about, how people can use public speaking and communication as a tool to influence people more and have more impact. Obviously, all of the tips and techniques you've given so far go a long way towards that, but is there anything else you might add to that?
Yeah, let me say two things. When trying to influence others, you really have to make the message relevant to people. So you have to find a way to help people understand its impact and what it means for them. I don't mean this to be disrespectful, but people are very selfish with their attention, with their time, with their focus and energy. So you have to get them to understand the impact and relevance. And that's where having that goal comes in mind, because it's not only about information, it's also about emotion. And we've known for millennia, since people were running around this planet in togas, that emotion matters. So if you can tap into some emotional concern that somebody has, that can really help you be influential. Additionally, when it comes to persuasion, motivation, and influence, many of us focus on just one side of the equation. We focus on all of the reasons why somebody should do something. Those are called promoting forces, all the reasons that promote what we're advocating for, saving money, saving trees, whatever we promote. Here are all the reasons to do it. But we also have to look at the reasons why somebody might not do it. So these are called restraining forces. It could be people don't have time, they don't think they know enough, they're afraid that it's too risky, whatever. And those restraining forces, often, if we can remove them or reduce them, can get to the desired behavior. Let me give you an example, and Christy, I share this example all the time. You know, I have two kids, they're teenagers now, but when they were younger, they did not want to eat their vegetables. They hated eating their vegetables. You would think, me being a communication guy, my wife being a PhD in psychology, you think we could get our kids to eat their vegetables, and we couldn't. You know, we tried every promoting idea we thought, you know, eat your vegetables, you grow up big and strong. Eat your vegetables, you'll be like your favorite athlete hero. Eat your vegetables, we'll pay you money. None of this worked. Why? They didn't like the way the vegetables looked or tasted. It wasn't until we removed some of those restraining forces, the taste and the texture, that they actually started eating their vegetables. And let me tell you, if you have young kids, putting ice cream sprinkles on broccoli can make a big difference in your life. And I say that as a joke, but it's also very true that changing the restraining forces can actually lead to more influential impact than focusing on the promoting forces.
Neat.
So a long-winded answer to your question, but it's really about tapping into emotion and relevance and looking both at promoting forces and restraining forces.
Yeah, that's great. And that seems to be a theme that's kind of running throughout here, is that it's as much about understanding where the issue's coming from or what might be holding people back than just, you know, adding on extra techniques to do something better. But it's about that sort of initial preparation.
That's
Great.
right. Oh, it's all about preparation.
Okay, well, I mean, I could ask you more questions, but I think what I'd like to do now is turn it over to our audience. And
Oh,
that will
great. I'd love to hear those questions. Yes.
we'll leave some extra time for you guys to ask any questions you might have of Matt. So again, first, thanks so much, Matt, for that overview. And for anyone who's got a question for Matt, please put it in the Q&A box rather than the chat box. And that's going to allow people to upvote questions. So it looks like we've already got one question here from Isabel. So I'll start with that one while everyone else is adding their questions in. And the question is it advisable to walk in the room when you give a conference? This helps me calm down a lot, but I'm not sure if it's right. So I guess, is walking around while you're presenting a good idea?
Well, so you changed the question that I initially heard. So I like physically moving around in the room before I start speaking. So if I have ever at a conference, you will see me walking around the audience talking to people. Absolutely. I do that to help connect, to get a sense of the space, etc. Now, the question, Christy, that you asked was, on stage, is it useful to walk? Yes, as long as the walking is not distracting. So there are times to walk and times to stand still. Walking at the beginning, stepping forward, is a great way to show that you are really confident approaching the audience, and moving during transitions. So when I'm moving from one idea to another in my content, I physically move on the space in the stage. That actually helps reinforce what I'm saying and that I'm transitioning. To move in between important points actually can be distracting. So if you ever watch a stand-up comedian, that's how you should move. Stand-up comedians move a lot during the setup of a joke, but during the punchline, they are standing perfectly still right in the center of the stage to land the joke. And that's a great way for you to think about moving.
Brilliant. Brilliant. Thanks. So I can see that people have started to upvote some questions here, which is great.
Great.
Mario's got a question. Matt, could you please give an example of a tongue twister?
Aha, my favorite tongue twister. Thank you for asking. I like this one because if you say it wrong, you say a naughty word. So my favorite tongue twister is, I slit a sheet I slit, and on that slitted sheet I sit, and I will let you figure out what the naughty word is. But I slit a sheet I slit, and on that slitted sheet I sit. I will say that 3 times fast before I start an event that I'm nervous about, and it helps me get present oriented.
Perfect. Thank you. Okay, so our next most popular question is, from Murph, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. You've emphasized faking it until you make it. if you struggle doing that, would you ever recommend people saying that they are nervous just to address the elephant in the room?
Absolutely not. And I get this question all the time. I think if you say I am so nervous or I'm sorry I'm so nervous, what you have done is primed the audience to pay attention to everything you do that supports your nervousness. I think you absolutely avoid doing that, because all it does is trigger people to focus on it. So I would much rather you just start talking, and if people will get engaged, they'll listen to your material, that will help you. But starting by acknowledging your nervousness, I don't think helps at all.
Yeah. Perhaps that's something that you can do on your own before you walk into that event is sort of
Well, yeah.
acknowledge.
So giving yourself permission to be nervous is very different than admitting it or stating it in front of others. It is critical that you give yourself permission to be nervous. Most people are. Research says 85% of people are nervous in high stakes communication situations. And I would argue the other 15% are lying. So the point is giving yourself permission to feel nervousness. This comes from the study of mindfulness. And if you've heard of mindfulness, it's a wonderful practice. In mindfulness, when you have an emotion, positive or negative, you experience it and you give yourself permission to sit with it. And the same is true with anxiety, because then you get a sense of agency in that rather than feeling like you're avoiding it or getting swept up by it. So giving yourself permission to experience it, acknowledging it yourself, absolutely 100% should do that. Admitting it in front of a group, acknowledging it, I think can work against you.
Great. Okay. Thank you. So we've got our next question from Deb. Hi, Deb. Nice to have you here. So a few faces that we know well and recognize in the audience. So Deb's asked, is there a trick to regain your train of thought if you blink while giving a presentation?
Thank you. The blanking out question. So let me start by saying things to do to help avoid blanking out, how to then make you feel less nervous about it, and what to do if you do blank out. So I get this question all the time. It's the number one fear people bring up to me is, I'm afraid I'm going to blank out. So how do you help yourself not blank out? One is practice. Perhaps surprisingly, one is not to memorize. Memorizing actually sets you up to blank out because you are using so many of your cognitive resources to keep track of what you're saying that you actually end up forgetting because you don't have enough cognitive resources to actually do the work, to do the speaking. So we want to practice. We want to avoid memorizing. So work off a note card or come up with questions that you ask yourself to prime yourself for what to say. And then have a structure. As I already talked about, having a structure helps. A structure is a map. You can't get lost if you have a map, or it's hard to get lost if you have a map. So that's the preparation piece. Practice, avoid memorizing, have a structure. The psychological approach piece is to really ask yourself, how likely is it that I'm going to blank out? On a scale of 0 to 10, how likely? For most of us, it's around a 1 or a 2. In reality, that I will absolutely blank out, maybe 10%, 20% of the time. So you need to think to yourself, that means 80 to 90% of the time, I'm not blanking out. And that helps rationalize the fear. So something that looms large, like, oh my goodness, I'm going to blank out, but it's not likely to happen. And when you recognize that, then you're less likely to be nervous about it. Third, when you actually do blank out, if it happens, two things: go back to go forward. Just like if you lose your keys, how do you find them? You retrace your steps. If you blank out what you're saying, you can often remember what you just said. So simply repeat yourself, and then you should be able to move forward from that. And then finally, if that doesn't help, ask your audience a question. Get them thinking about something to give yourself time to catch up. So when I teach my MBA students, I sometimes forget, did I say this already? Where should I go next? So what I'll do is I'll just stop and I'll say, let's pause for a moment. And I'd like for you to think about how what we've just covered can be applied to your life. And while they're thinking about that, I'm thinking about, where do I go next? Now, the nice thing is what I teach allows me to ask a question like that. You have to figure out a question that can work for you when you blank out, that helps people to think about what you've just said and gives yourself time. So for example, if you're giving a presentation in a meeting and you blank out, you could say, let's pause for a moment and think about how what we were just talking about applies to our overarching goal. And then if you really need extra time, you could say, share with me, what do you think? And then you can come back to your topic. So it starts with preparation, so you aren't likely or are less likely to blank out. You have to change your approach and realize the actual likelihood of blanking out is less than I think it is, and then, or feel that it is. And then ultimately, if I blank out, I go back to go forward, or I have a question I ask to buy myself some time. You can tell, Christy, I've had that question before.
I can tell but it's brilliant because it gives everyone such a structured way to think about it. So it's
Thank
perfect.
you. Yeah.
All right. So we had 10 people vote for this next question from Aubin. If someone asks you a question that you need a moment to think about before answering, what do you do to get another moment to think without looking like you don't know the answer or making something up?
I am a huge fan of paraphrasing. You might have noticed that when Christy asks me questions, part of setting expectations, I paraphrase the question. So paraphrasing a question, not repeating it word for word, but paraphrasing it gives you a little extra time. It turns out that we can paraphrase without activating too much of our cognitive mechanisms and infrastructure to help us, so we can be thinking of the answer and paraphrasing it at the same time. So paraphrasing is a great way to buy yourself some time. You could also ask a clarifying question. If somebody asks you a question, you could say, before I answer, do you mean this or that, or help me? So that buys you some time as well. But also realize that pausing before you answer isn't that bad. It feels much longer for you than it does for your audience. So being reflective, thinking about it isn't a bad thing.
Great. Thank you. And thanks, Owen, for asking that question. Okay, so our next one is from Diana, and she's asked, are there any specific suggestions on how to deal with anxiety for virtual meetings and or presentations where often you are not even seeing your audience, like in this situation right now, so you can't really assess how receptive they are?
Yes, so much of what I've talked about already applies virtual or in person. A couple things that can help you virtually. One, if you can't see everybody, and that leads to some of the problems. So one is to record yourself. Most of these tools have recording features. So as you practice, record yourself, look what it looks like so you can understand what they're seeing. Because part of it is, what do I look like to them? How does this look for them? By recording yourself, you can see that, and that can help reduce that. I like to actually take pictures of people I care about and tape it right behind my camera. So I literally adhere it right behind my camera. So when I'm talking, I'm actually talking to pictures of people rather than just to a camera. So that can help reduce some of the anxiety. And then coming up with mechanisms to actually get and solicit feedback from your audience can be very helpful. So what do I mean by that? Asking questions, taking polls, having people type into the chat. That gets people involved, and that gives you some feedback, so it can make you feel better. So if I, share something with you, I'm like, did that even land? Were they even paying attention? But if I were to say, okay, in the chat, tell me what that means for you or how you can apply that, and I see some things come back, then I feel as if people are listening. So those are some things you can do to help foster engagement and reduce your anxiety around speaking virtually.
Great. And I know that's a very relevant question in the conservation sector, because even before, pre-COVID times, it's quite common to interview virtually and to work with teams virtually. So I can see why that's a useful one. Okay, so we've got a question from Nayad or Nayade. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Would over practicing your speech be counterproductive?
It can be. It can be. So practicing is important, but over practicing invites memorizing, and it gets to a point where it becomes so ingrained in you that if anything changes for any reason, it's hard to adapt. So my way of getting around over practicing is to do what I call chunking. Chunking is where you take your content, and rather than go through it beginning, middle, end, beginning, middle, end, beginning, middle, end, chunk it into different pieces. So maybe you start with the ending, and then you do the beginning, and then you do the middle part. So you practice the chunks, and each time you practice them in a different order, it breaks that rote pattern that can be problematic. And the added benefit is it lets you spend more time on certain parts that we don't. Most people, when they practice, spend a lot of time on the beginning and less time on the end. And you as a speaker have probably noticed this. You sort of getting towards the end going, oh crap, how am I going to end this thing? Because you didn't practice it enough. So by doing these different chunking, you actually give attention and time to things that you often wouldn't. So it only helps your communication.
Okay, brilliant. So we've got a question here from Melissa, and she's asked, people with ADHD can have a really hard time staying still and keep the focus on a linear direction. Do you have any suggestions for tackling public speaking for neurodiverse people?
Absolutely. There's a good friend of mine, a former student, is one of the leaders in the neurodiversity movement. So I'm very familiar with the cause and support it. If you're talking about as a speaker, if you are somebody who has something like ADHD, then find different ways of communicating your points. So when I think about my points, I think about what are different ways I can support it. Can I tell a story? Can I give some statistics? Can I show a video? So I'm thinking about from my own perspective, when I share it, do I have lots of different tools that I can rely on to help me get that across? If I'm worried that my audience might be distracted or have some neurodiversity issues, then I need to do the same thing. I need to communicate in a diverse way using lots of diverse tools to help get my message across. So I do a lot of repetition. I do lots of different things. So I might give you a statistic, then tell you a story, then show you a video, then ask you a question about it. All of those, hopefully one of those four ways will land with you and will resonate with you in that moment. So many of us structure our content and deliver our content in ways that work for us as the presenter. And yet we need to think about the way the audience, the receiver, will take up our messaging. So that's an important part as well.
Great. Thanks for that. And thanks for the question. Great question. So we've got probably about 5 minutes or so left for questions. So the next one here is from Olena, and her question is how to stay positive with your message, encourage people for action or encourage people to take action, while the essence of your message is gloom, like disappearance of species, climate change, basically most environmental problems.
Yeah, that's a tough one, huh? I wish I had a really good answer for that. So again, I think it's about relevance. I think what we know from the research in psychology and communication is that if people feel disempowered, they are likely to tune out. So find a way to show how people can actually help and contribute and make a meaningful difference. Using some real world examples where people can connect, so people can say, oh, somebody did something like that and made a significant difference. That can be empowering as well. And then it all has to do with your demeanor, the word choice you use, how you approach it in terms of your tone. There's an old acting trick that if you have to convey an emotion in a scene, before you go into that scene, you reflect on a time in your life when you had that emotion and you carry that with you. So if you're trying to be positive, think about something that gets you really excited and positive before you enter the room. So I think it's finding relevant success stories that demonstrate people's value that they can bring and the fact that they can actually do something meaningful rather than just being overwhelmed by the severity of the problem. So that could be just changing the focus, maybe focusing more in a concentrated, narrow area rather than the broader picture. But there are ways to motivate people in those situations.
Yeah, I really like what you said about giving people, even if it's doom and gloom, giving people the opportunity to take action,
Right.
to help improve it. And we actually, I wanted to mention two more things on that.
Yeah.
First, there's something called the Positive Communications Toolkit, which is developed by Conservation Optimism. So that's quite conservation focused. And it has some tools, around communicating conservation and environmental messages positively. So it's called Positive Communications Toolkit. We'll share it in the resources later, together with the recording, but that's worth checking out. And we actually just launched a course called Communications for Conservation Projects here at Conservation Careers. So some of you here today are probably on that, where we're kind of talking about how do you communicate conservation projects and get people on board with that too. So very relevant question. Okay, thanks, Elena. So I think we'll take two more questions here.
Okay, great.
The next is I'm just starting out in a large carnivore conservation. As you can imagine, public debates can become quite heated. How is it possible to diffuse a situation if and when these kind of questions start getting out of hand?
So pre-work helps. Understanding what the possible trigger points are and tectonic plate, rubbing against each other, where those fault lines are, that's helpful. So you can't anticipate everything, but at least focusing on some things can really help you. So I strongly encourage you to think about that in advance. In the moment when it's happening, again, I talked about paraphrasing as a way to buy yourself time. Paraphrasing is a way of recognizing differences and then getting things back on track. So imagine you are in a heated discussion, a meeting where people are really flaring up and you got some spice going in the room. As a facilitator, as somebody who wants to drive towards a goal, I highlight some of the information that's being said. I extract it, paraphrase it, and then move on. So I might say something along the lines like, I really hear your passion towards this one approach. I'm curious to know how others feel about this approach, or how others might suggest a different approach. So you acknowledge, so you validate that you've heard. It doesn't mean you agree. You just validate that you've heard, you name it, and then you can transition on from it. We want to avoid naming people's emotions. So we don't want to say, well, you sound frustrated. And the person, I'm not frustrated. I'm just passionate, or I'm just angry. No, we don't want to be debating people's emotional states. We say, I hear you have a lot of passion, or I hear a lot of energy behind this point. What do you think? Or how does that fit with our overarching goal? So you can actually interrupt somebody by just saying, wait, that point you just made, very important. I hear that you're really passionate. What do the others say? The paraphrase is the politest way I know to validate and give permission to interrupt and then move on. It can feel awkward to do, but with time, you can feel more comfortable and it can really help you in what you're trying to get across.
Great, thank you. I don't know if you can see me watching the Q&A here, but we've got a competition between who's going to have the last question. Interesting back and forth. So it goes to Marlowe's. Again, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. And the question is, do you have any tips on talking with your hands? When I get nervous, I talk with my hands way too much. I do it way too much, and it just doesn't look right.
So I do. I have lots of, I talk with my hands a lot too. So often what makes it look not right is it's fast. And it's fast because many of us get nervous. And when we get nervous, we talk faster and we sync our gesture speed with our speaking rate. So if you can slow the gestures down, you will slow down your speaking rate. Taking a deep breath will also help. Second, think about descriptive gestures versus emphatic gestures. Descriptive gestures actually describe things. So if I say this is a big problem, or we want to make sure revenues increase, those gestures are describing. It's like playing charades. If you focus on the descriptive gestures, those are the ones that are seen often as most helpful, and then try to refrain from the emphatic gestures, just where the hands are moving because you're speaking. That can reduce the number of gestures that you do. Quite frankly, in all the work I do, I rarely tell people they're gesturing too much. I often will tell people they're speaking too fast, which will then slow down their gesturing. Most people don't gesture enough. So I think, so I would just question, you're thinking you're gesturing a lot, but it might not be too much. It might just be you're speaking too quickly because of your anxiety. So best way to do it, record yourself presenting, see what it looks like. We are not a good judge of our own speaking rate or our own gestures when we're seeing it from ourselves. So watching it through a recording gives us interesting insight.
Great. Brilliant. Thanks so much, Matt. So I think,
yeah, no worries.
I think we're going to have to leave it there for the questions for today. Thanks everyone for your questions. They've been brilliant. And I just want to wrap up by saying, obviously a huge thanks, Matt, for coming onto the webinar today as a guest. It's been a real treat for us.
Well, it has been an absolute pleasure. What you all are doing, and those of you who are looking to do this work, is so critical to this world that anything I can do to help is absolutely time well spent. All the best in everything you are trying to do. And please, please, please stay focused on that, and best of luck.
Great. So if anyone wants to find out more or get in touch with you or learn more about what you do, where's the best place for them to go?
Let me point you to a couple things, if that's okay, Christy. So I have a consulting practice, Bold Echo, and you can look at boldecho.com. We want your messages to be bold, and we want them to echo long after you're gone. There is a webpage I curate that has lots of different resources for becoming a better communicator. It's called nofreakingspeaking.com. And that title, nofreakingspeaking.com, comes from the book I wrote that Christy was kind enough to mention early on. It's called Speaking Up Without Freaking Out. You can get that at Amazon or other places. And Speaking Up Without Freaking Out will help provide you with tools as well as specific step-by-step practices you can put in place. And the last thing I'll say is I host a podcast for the Stanford Graduate School of Business called Think Fast, Talk Smart. And it's all about how to become a better communicator. I get to interview some of the brightest minds of academics and elsewhere on communication skills. So feel free to listen into that on specific topics like persuasion, like negotiation. And hopefully one or more of these resources can help you continue your journey. I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge Toastmasters. If you have not heard of Toastmasters, you should look into it. A great organization designed to help people be more effective in their communication.
That's great. So we're going to share, obviously, the recording of this webinar for anyone who couldn't make it today. And when we do that, we'll share all of those links too, so that you can go and find more information and practice your public speaking skills. And I just want to end by saying also a huge thanks to everyone who's part of the Conservation Careers community and our journey. So this year alone, we've helped over 500,000 conservationists all around the world. And one of the biggest accomplishments, I think, for us this year has been reaching over 1,000 students on our Conservation Career Kickstarter online course that helps people kickstart their careers in conservation. And we've actually run that at 40 universities this year. So we're really thrilled to have done that. And we couldn't have done that without support from people all around the world. We're also launching a new accelerator program for people who are switching careers into conservation, coming from the communications and marketing sector. So we're really excited about that. So stay tuned for that one in the new year. And if you want to see who's behind the scenes at Conservation Careers, something we don't always get a chance to talk about, we've just published a blog a post on our blog. So you can go to our website and find out a little bit more about what goes on behind the scenes at Conservation Careers, see some of the team that's involved from all over the world. And again, thanks so much, Matt, for being here. I think this has been an invaluable resource for the people who are here live, for all the people who are going to watch this recording after. And I'm really excited about, how people can put this into practice, like you said, to do great things in the world. So
great.
Huge thanks again.
Well, thank you very much. All the best in all that you do. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. I hope you're all safe and well heading into the holidays. Bye for now.